So yes, my name is Marcus, and I work for XenServer. And today I'm going to be talking about our experience in the past year using observability across our Toolstack and in other components of the Xen ecosystem that use inside XenServer. And I would start, by just trying to recap the problem that we used to have in the beginning of 2023. So I was here talking about this as well. I was here talking about this as well. And the main problem here that I'm trying to solve is that the complexity of any system grows over time. And we have this problem with XenServer. So XenServer has evolved over the years. So XenServer has a history of about 20 years. And we have more and more components being added all the time. The team grows, and it becomes complicated for everybody to understand each other, right? So we have upstream users. These are orchestrations user, for instance, XenSent and other orchestration clients. And downstream vendors like NFS server vendors, for instance, all integrating together with our Toolstack. We have the Xen hypervisor and even host hardware. So all different things that can misbehave or can behave in unexpected ways. And you put this all together, it becomes complicated. An example, for instance, is that yes, we can have a team like XenServer that's been there for 20 years, and we can have a junior engineer that has just started, and it takes like months for a junior engineer to be able to understand the complexity currently of XenServer. And well, the other way happens as well. So you have a senior engineer, it knows everything about the system, but what it knows is about 20 years old. So it needs to understand how the system is currently working, and this helps. So this helps handle complexity, and if apply the thing to all the components of the Xen ecosystem, this is going to help everybody. So how does that compare with, I think, what is the current problem that you have here? So we have evolved a little bit. So right now, we still have this stack of different components here. But I think now we have decided, by just looking at our experience in the past year, that we also need to pay attention to features and to the environment that's associated with the different levels or instance of our Toolstack. So by feature, I mean different activities that is visible to the end user, like for instance, VM start. So these are the sort of things that we'd like to track because users see that and they care about that, and we support that. So we'd like to track these different features in an explicit way, and that's why I think from now on, we'd like to have this added to our idea of the problem for this year and beyond, and environment as well, and make that explicit, that when you run our stack of components with the features, we still have another dimension in which we have different environments. For instance, developer can run the code, whatever it is that is the Toolstack here, get some result. We can run this in test environment, we might get some other result, and in production as well. And it's interesting because in the case here, we may have situations in which production may have an environment in which you may not be able to represent properly in our test environment. So there are millions of different configurations that customers can have in their test environments. We have a limited amount of time, a limited amount of hardware that we have to run all possible tests in different environments. Being able to have these components, obtaining data out of different environments for free, from production, for instance, or for commissioning or development, that helps a lot. So it's not only about the components, but keep in mind that also talk about features and environments, and that's very important to keep in mind when you think about the problem that I'm trying to solve here from now on. And fortunately, the good point here is that it's the same solution for this new problem. So we did have a solution based in observability and distributed tracing, and that's still the same solution for this updated problem as well. So what you have here is that you have these lines. These lines here is essentially some series of activities that has been triggered by a user action at the top, VM start, for instance, or BDI create, or whatever, something that's visible to the user. And currently, is normal across different components that use to observe what's happening. We use logs or metrics. And I'd like to put the idea here in terms of observability that traces are also very important, actually, if not more than logs. So what's the difference between logs, traces, and metrics in here in this environment? So logs is something that has an event with a single timestamp. That's something that we collect all the time. So have a single timestamp, something happened this timestamp, and that's it. Traces is more complicated. It's the thing that you see on the left here. It's more complete. And it contains what we call an activity span. And it always contains 2 timestamps, a begin and an end. And this line of activity allows you to name the activity. And it's substantially different of what a log is, which is a single timestamp. A metric is essentially a sort of aggregation of results of summarizing of what has happened in logs. Okay, and try to get the number of existing activities in a specific minute, or like VM starts, or try to see how much of fraction of CPU that has been used for in the seconds. This is essentially what we call metrics, but essentially it's just a way of summarizing logs or traces that has been obtained. And why is it distributed? It's distributed tracing because we do have different components. In this case here, the ones that are represented in red and in blue, and they can send signals across these different components. And this is used to create a data structure that can then be added together somewhere else, and then we can see that or act on that, doing search, for instance, or selections, or automating analysis of the results. So what are the benefits for the Xen ecosystem here? So the first one is that we have an agreement of user visible features. So if we're forced to measure actions with a begin timestamp and an end timestamp, like VM start, for instance, that means that users on these different environments agree on what is being measured. That's quite important. So I don't know how many of you have been in meetings in which one side of the table says, look, my VM start is taking, I don't know, a minute, for instance. And the other one says, oh, it's taking a second. So that's an enormous conversation, discussion about why is it that is different. And you end up in a situation in which someone can say, OK, my VM start is taking a second. It's because I'm doing XVM start. And I build the domain, and I plug the I/O devices. And the CPU is unpaused, and that's it. That's the end. The device has started running. And the other one on the other side, the same taking a minute, say, OK, I do that as well. But I'm also measuring Windows booting and autoexec.batch execute, and then an app that needs to stop loading at the end, and that takes a minute. And that's, I mean, it's a waste of time because it's measuring different things. So of course, it's different. So it's being able to agree on what to actually be measured across different things is very important. It's very useful. And it's about 50% of the problems associated with metrics and measurements, and it's gone because you already have this well-defined and by default, because you need to force someone to be able to collect this information because of the begin and event and named VM start as well. It's comparable because it's the same thing in the code that's running across different environments. We're decoupling the test from measurements because now measurement always happens whenever you have the code and you have enabled the infrastructure here to collect the code. So measurements always happen. You can test it independent of being concerned about collecting measurements, not. Whatever is run as a developer, you're collecting. With a test, collecting, production, commissioning, whatever it is that you're trying to collect. And also delegation of environments. So that's the thing I was saying. In a test environment, may not be able to reproduce all possible environments of a customer. Too many customers, millions of environments, but the customer has its own environment. And if it runs the environment, enable that, it has a problem, it can collect the data associated with the problem, and then can debug that later. So that's what we use in our CLI for XenServer to try to enable this infrastructure here. You have a concept of something called an observer. And you can attach tags or attributes to this observer, which allows you to track this instance of the observer across different environments. And you also have something that's important called an endpoint URL. So that's the output where you submit the data that you collect. And you're going to see later some examples why that's important. But you can have many different endpoints, and you need to have an infrastructure of this endpoint if you want to be able to analyze this later. So you need to store that, and then you're able to analyze and obtain useful results out of it. And also have a tool, it's called XStrace. It allows you to copy between different endpoints, which is also very useful. In our case, by default, we're storing things in our file system, in our log directory, but we're able to copy this to an endpoint URL so that can visualize and analyze that later by using this simple command line here. So you can find the source code in these URLs here. So what did that accomplish in this year of observability here? So have this series of different components that we have instrumented the code to try to collect. There's open trace out of the execution of this binary. So you can start at the top with the SDK. So this is the interface that you have from customers trying to connect to our daemons in DOM0 in XenServer. And we have instrumented the CLI commands and our daemon XAPI, XenOpsD, XMExec, and they are all produce this sort of data. And when they try to start some activity inside XenServer, they also call other tools that we have instrumented as well. And what is generated at the end, here's an example, is a tree of activities that you see. It starts at the top there, so that's the first activity that's user visible. In this case, it's a VM start that has been submitted by executing either the SDK or XCLI. And you can see now that XAPI is calling XenOpsD. And XenOpsD is calling XAPI again. And XAPI is calling another component called SNAPI that's calling XAPI again. These things are all hidden before. Seasoned engineers would know about it, but they had this knowledge of 20 years ago, and this changed. It changed all the time. So they don't have this up-to-date environment. Now we can produce real-time architectural diagrams. So essentially, this is documentation that's been produced in real time about the exactly branch, commit, build that you have execute at the moment, whatever in development or test, or production, or support, or commission, whatever it is. So this is being produced all the time. We enable that, produce, collect information, etc. And we're now trying to branch down. So this is essentially the Toolstack, right? So we're trying to start VMs and do the sort of operations which try to create the environment for the gas to run. But we're also trying to extend our collection of data to the data path as well. So that's what happens when you have, let's say, an I/O request from inside a guest. The guest executes some I/O requests. This thing goes down through zero, executes daemon, and then the kernel, and, well, drivers, etc. And this takes time to execute inside zero. At some point, it goes out into the wild to our downstream vendors, so the NFS server vendors, and at some point it returns back. So if we're able to track down as well the data path, we should be able very easily to find out if the I/O latency inside the gas is due of something happening inside zero across one of these components, or something outside zero because of on-prem defective component of the customer that's in production. And you should be able to easily spot if that's the case, and just tell the customer very quickly, look, you are experiencing some higher alerts because inside the VMs, not because of zero, but because of your own defective, whatever, NFS storage, whatever, something that might be using that. So we are trying to extend to that. We do have a prototype in which we are using BPF trace to try to probe some activities inside the XenGas. And that's an interesting component here because it kind of mix between control plane and data path. So it happens during a VM migrate. So executing this during VM migrate, that's essentially used to copy the VM memory across to different domains on different hosts. But because you're copying the VM memory, there's also involved with the data path, so network, etc. You are able, by using BPF trace, which tries to attach to the dwarf symbols of existing binaries in non-zero, we're able to track or create breakpoints very easily. And this breakpoint associated with a script, a BPF script that's executed, collects data in some form that you might want to collect, and then we're able to push this somewhere else to try to produce this data for the data path. So that's something I just started. So we don't have a nice graph for the data path yet, but something that I'm planning to do now next month. And as an example here of what you have in terms of control plane that we have able to obtain now all the time is here. So that's essentially a zooming of what the other diagram that was there. At the top, we have something important. It's the VM start. That's the user visible feature that you care about. I remember that there was some talk yesterday about requirements and documentation and safety, and I think this is the point in which you can hook in those automation of requirements and safety and features. So this feature, user visible features, is what requirements are about. So the requirement should say, look, this feature should be executed perhaps with these parameters, taking that long at most if you have that many parallel. And because this thing is aligned, you can have many parallel execute and can even collect the fact that, okay, let's take up to 2 seconds if there are 100 of them in parallel. So this is possible to extract and to detect automatically if it's in the requirement because you're collecting this all the time. So if you can attach requirements with this, entity at the top here, that's also called user feature. I would say that this is the most important span of activity because that's what the user sees. What's underneath that is essentially debugging, but also allows you to see on the engineer, the existing complexity of the system and how they interact. So we have see different layers here. That's XenAPI, that's our interface calling XAPI, which is our daemon that passes the request. XenOpsD that executes the VM activity of the control plane. Calling back XAPI again, to execute something, that's calling another layer, another component. If this component is calling XAPI again from the point of view as if it was a customer or a user, but well, doing something else, right? In this case, just querying a specific amount of time. This was hidden before. So seasonal engineers would know something about it, but they would not find a specific quest because it was added for some June engineer, for instance, recently. So this is now all available, real time, and makes so much easier to understand what's going on with a new branch, for instance, or whatever. This is another view of the same data. So as I said, you can use the same data to do queries. We are using here something called the Aga UI. So there are many tools that can be used because this is using standards. We submit this in standard, storing standards. So just get this data collected, submit it to some open source tool, and then are able to collect this flame graph, for instance, that just says, look, there was a VM here that we're trying to start. This amount of time was split into activities in different components. Interestingly, here in this component, it took a long time here. Most of the time was spent in these three specific actions here. In this case, in the data, in the storage layer, that's about VDI epoch begin, VDI attach, and VDI activate. So VDI activate took a long time, and that's interesting in itself because it should not take that long. It took a long time because this other activity here happened inside our Python scripts inside our storage layer. So it's all justifiable here, very easy to see what's going on. If there's a problem at the top, you can easily link to something going wrong at the bottom here. And this can be automated because it's all in a data structure that can be passable and queryable. An example with our XCCLI tool, we are able to pass the tracing parameter that I was talking about, which goes across the different layers and link them together into a single data structure of a tree. We are able to pass this as a parameter, which means you are able to call two commands with the same trace parameter so that appears as two trees on the same visualization. This is available now as part of this work that we did in the past year. This also, when execute this XCCLI command, it sends a trace parent using a standard, W2C standard, and that means that we're trying to be as much standards compliant as possible with this, so that we are able to interact with the existing tools as much as possible. This is an example of the SDK, so that's the language that binds to our API, our XML RPC API. So I have two examples here. So the C# SDK is now able to accept arbitrary headers, which is these HTTP headers here, which are past trace parents, and our Python SDK, which is available here. We now try to automatically detect if it's running inside a context of a span. And if it is, it just sends the header of the existing span over to the Xen API. And that's how I'm able to obtain this information about Xen API calling back into XAPI that you saw in that previous trace tree. Observe.py is another example here of something that's potentially very useful for other users of Xen Ecosystem components. You are able to pass a trace parent again as a root of the tree. But interestingly, this observe.py is a Python script that wraps around any existing Python command or something to be introspected. And it creates hooks and wraps every function. So it goes across modules and classes and functions of each of the functions and classes and wraps automatically these spans around them. So whenever each function is executed, it collects data about the execution time. And that's why in that previous tree, you are able to obtain information about the storage activities. So the storage activities associated with the storage repositories here, SR and FSSR, that's associated with the data path. But when you create that thing here, that's what happens. That's examples of observer.py trying to collect the data automatically. It's quick, very quick. You see, microseconds to try to do that. That's a BPF traces and guest example. So that's the thing about the data path, which are trying to use or attach to the data path using BPF trace, so activities here. So you see the blue one is about percentage of time of amount of data that has been transmitted. So 0% doing a migration here, 99%, 100%, that's a second pass of migration. You can capture all of them, but trace context is not easily available here, and they're trying to figure out how to do that. So that's a prototype and try. So we can pass in two different ways. One of them is, as I said before, trying to see if we can pass something, the environment variables, trace parent here, over this specific green bits here. So if you're able to capture that, most of the problem of trying to link this together is done. Otherwise, you may need to try to combine individual existing IDs that's already there, like PID, TID, DOM ID, and see if you can get a unique number that's able to link them all together. Something that we're going to try this year here. So what we're trying, right, is standard. You like standards, try to use them as much. That makes it easier to use with other tools, OpenTelemetry, HTTP headers, trace context, Jaeger. Open source, they're very easy to use. We like the fact that we now agree on metrics across the different layers. So enthusiasts, dev, test, prod, partners, even PM now agree, or may agree on what is there. And the main problem that we have right now is actually transparent, the propagation of that single element that allows you to link things together. So you can pass the transparent, but that means you either need to be able to understand that you have passed it. It's more difficult if you have some code that cannot be changed. And that takes us to the challenge. So propagate the trace context is a real challenge here. If you cannot change your code, for instance, you're trying to probe into some existing driver or kernel, it's more difficult to change. We try to use an approach in which you try to probe using BPF trace, as I said before, try to use these different ideas as a replacement for the fact that you don't have the trace ID, and then post-process that and try to see if you can get a unique trace ID that's able to connect things together. Infrastructure, that's another thing, because it's difficult to get an infrastructure for all the different components that you're trying to store these together. So you can manually create this infrastructure. But the thing is, you would like to have an infrastructure as a code somewhere that allows you to easily create all of this stuff. Dangerous here. Okay. So yes, analysis as well. So that's a challenge because you don't want to get all of this data without being able to analyze them. So being able to analyze and get quick results out of it is very important. And feedback in terms of Boolean pass-fail, that's what we usually get with functional situations, environments. But here it's more difficult because you need to analyze data that's performance data. Problems UIs, there are problem improvements in UIs that can do at the moment. So you are able to use UIs, but they can be improved. So that one contains all the components together. They're very small, difficult to see, difficult to use. This one here on the right side, you can analyze a specific trace, but analyze them together, trying to get an average or difference or union is not possible at the moment. So that's something we'd like to improve in the future. Getting the Boolean results out of the existing data is something that you manually need to do. There's no tool or no easy tool that can do that for us. So that's a tool that we created that tries to get a pass or fail automatically out of the data, but that's something we had to create. Infrastructure, as I was saying, infrastructure as a code. We are trying to create that for us, but the existing infrastructure tools, open source, they don't easily have IACs that can use together to do all of this together. So that's some work that we're trying to do together. And our solution, our XAPI observer, he should try to create some sort of standard, initial standard, he should try to enable, disable all these components together with a single command, as you said, you saw before in the XCLI. And that's what we see here, the single command observer create that I was mentioning before, broadcast the information that, okay, I would like to collect data of all of the existing daemons in non-zero, and then it uses or starts broadcast this trace parent across all of the different components here, which is what you do at the moment in terms of trying to create our own standard to try to make this easier for anyone to use all of them together. And finally, we have design patterns here that we like to suggest to use. There are 3 of them. The first one is the feature pattern, in which you have the top, the red one, the user visible activity. That's the thing that you care about. You can link to requirements. You can say how long it takes, etc. Automatically try to verify if there's a regression or not. That's what you care about. The one in orange at the bottom there, so for debugging purpose only. It's okay, useful for engineers, they understand what's happening, real-time architecture, but it's for debugging purpose only. The observer part is the one I was just talking about here. It's very important to be able to provide the environments in which you're running this, to be able to compare them across developer, environment, test, production, and we provide the possibility of passing these attributes here. So you either pass them externally or intrinsically generate them in your code if you're able to do that. And you're able to accept different endpoints, as I said. So this is all part of the infrastructure. And the final thing is the trace context part, which is how to generate this trace parent thing to link them all together. If you can change your code, easy. If you cannot change your code, you need to use some combination of PID, TIDs, DOM IDs, whatever. All the IDs you have available in your function at the moment to see if you can create something that's unique and allows you to link them all together. And yes, that's the main question we have right now for the data path. And that's something that we'll be interested in discussing more here later, perhaps in a design session, which is how do you get a trace parent for some existing code, which you may not want to change right now. For instance, whatever, when you have a block device request for VVD or a network interface device for VIF. We do have some IDs. They are available somehow, sometimes, in functions that can grab using BPF trace. But ideally, we'd like to be able to pass our existing trace ID that we have for that request across all the different layers which means changing the code potentially, because usually the data structures don't accept any or don't allow you to add a specific new field that's only for trace parent. That's actually a useful pattern to think about in the future. Whenever you add the structure, think about debugging, have a structure that allows you to get a trace parent ID, it's like a random ID that's being passed across. This applies as well to data path protocols, so not only code in our DOM0, but NF, we want to be able to measure NF response, SCAS response, GFS response, and that goes across the board. So I'm not sure if I have time for questions now, but we can discuss this later. Yeah, okay. So.
Yeah, just is it possible? I mean, your course Observer Python, it's hooking the code to add a course to send traces. If I understood correctly.
Yes.
Does it work only for Xen code, or does it apply to any?
It applies to any Python code.
Only Python?
This observer.py applies to Python code.
And what other ones?
So the other ones, it applies, so you could use the design pattern for the code, but it only applies to XenServer at the moment.
It could work for apps or anything?
The idea of the design could, yes. But you need to write it, yes. It's written locally, which means
it's possible.
it's possible, yeah. Yeah. You could adapt it. It's open source, so you should be available to how to use it. Any more question? No? Okay, that's all then.